Hi, everybody. My name is Brent Maynard, and I am the product manager for Amazon Detective. We have a pretty loaded presentation for everybody today. We're going to talk a little bit about elevating your security investigations with generative AI. We're going to talk a little bit about the 4 launches that Detective has this week. We're pretty excited to talk about. My partner in crime.
My name is Keith Gilbert. I'm a security engineering manager in the enterprise security services within AWS. I usually like to start off with a little bit of kind of interactive polling to just get a pulse on the audience. Pretty full room, so I'm expecting kind of a mix of responses. But first off, how many people flew in today?
Just today?
Quite a few. Just trying to kind of understand how crazy we should be to keep people kind of awake if they're already dealing with jet lag.
It's only day 1.
It is. So beyond that, how many folks here have seen a prior talk or are aware of kind of the current feature set of Detective?
Ooh.
All right, pretty new audience. That's awesome. So kind of one step further, was going to ask beyond that, how many folks have either already caught the releases or read any of the new features that we're going to be talking about that got published this morning by chance?
I think Steve Schmidt just talked about it a few minutes ago.
Indeed. So I think we got like 2, but other than that, pretty net new. So that's great. As Brent mentioned, a lot of exciting releases that we're going to kind of stitch together, show you how to use them all in line from end to end for an investigation.
Yeah, we have a pretty cool presentation today, as I was mentioning. We're going to talk a bit about Detective and level set everybody on the capabilities of the service, how it's offered today, and how you can use it. We're also going to talk a little bit about how we can investigate a real investigation that's relevant and actually recently occurred, which is pretty cool. Credential compromise. I think everybody's top concern when it comes to cloud security is it's around identity, and we continue to see that. So we're going to talk and dive in a little bit more with Keith. And more so, how do we detect these type of attacks, and what does that look like for us? What problems are we seeing in the market? That's the big question, and everybody is talking about security when it comes to cloud. Everybody's talking about how to hire security, how to maintain security, and what does that mean for us? And we'll talk about the generative AI stuff here in a minute too. But we have to focus on the problems we're trying to solve. We have alert fatigue. There's thousands of findings or events happening within our environments at any given point in time. There's no way that Keith or I or any of you could respond to all of those. So how do you pick which ones? And for the ones you do choose, how do you know they're the right ones? Are you prioritizing them properly? And let's say you do prioritize them properly, and you're going through all of your events. Eventually, you're going to start seeing some burnout. And it happens in security. You have to be careful. And then maybe if you don't have burnout, how do you staff your team appropriately? How do you scale the people, process, and technology within your environment? Detective can help there. And when we look at logging events, we talk about data. We talk about bringing all of that data in. We know like VPC flow logs and CloudTrail can be quite voluminous. So what do we do with that data, and how do you manage it? Do you manage it? Does somebody manage it for you? Or maybe Detective can manage that for you. So what is Detective? Detective is a managed security service that brings in all of your logs and findings for you, which we'll dive in a little bit more, and it processes it in a graph database. And with that graph database, we're then doing statistical analysis and machine learning over top of your data to provide you the best possible outcome when it comes to your security experience. Not so much features, but let's talk about the outcomes. And that's really the focus of this entire talk. It's like, how can we get through an investigation, and what does that get me at the end of the day? Really, we're just looking to have faster, more efficient investigations and keeping our people happy and ensuring that we're protecting the things that are most important to us. How does Detective work? So we've talked a bit about log analysis and how much data we can bring in and where we're bringing our data in from. So if we look at, we have CloudTrail logs, EKS audit logs, we have guard duty findings, Security Hub findings, which we know there's a lot going into Security Hub today if you're a Security Hub customer, as well as using VPC flow logs to help us identify what's going on in any given cloud estate. Now, we take all of that data and put it into the Detective behavioral graph. And as we populate that graph, you'll see it represented within your console experience. Now, before it gets there, we have to provide some level of analytics on top of it because just giving raw data back is not going to be helpful. So what we're doing is we're using an algorithm we call finding groups, where we're taking all of your findings and all of your log telemetry to prioritize and group those findings in a manner that's easier to respond. Because let's say you have a group of guard duty findings, for example. They all are high severity. How do you pick which ones to respond to? Well, finding groups brings in the context of inspector. So let's say there's a vulnerability on an EC2 instance, for example, and it has a guard duty finding. We'll group those together, as well as the IAM principles involved, and you can tell a better story and prioritize that event accordingly. Talk a little bit about the types of Security Hub findings that come in. We can read all of them. There's quite a few coming in, and this was a release earlier this year at Reinforce that we're really proud of, and this provides you greater fidelity and greater precision when you're looking at the types of data coming in, and it gives us more elements that we can connect in the graph. When we look at the graph, it's like, I always imagine the detective graph is like you have the investigator with the corkboard and just all the red lines and all the pictures connected to it. That's essentially what detective is doing for you, but it's also circling and highlighting those events and telling you, hey, this one's the most important one. So let's talk a bit about what it looks like inside when we look at, we talked about an EC2 instance, for example. So you see here, we had a guard duty finding that was detected. That's what guard duty does very well. An inspector found a vulnerability. Okay, it's a good start. But then we take it a step further. What IP address was on that? Was there any other IP addresses related to this EC2 instance we should worry about? Or is anything else connected to it? And then you see we bring identity into play. So now we have a guard duty finding, we have a threat. We have an inspector finding, we have a vulnerability. We have an IP address we can pivot off of. We have an EC2 instance, of course, that's affected in all this. And then we go a bit deeper and we say, okay, well, it looks like this IAM principle was involved. What else did this IAM principle do? We're going to teach you today how to dive into IAM principles and how to get a full report and do your full triage on which resources that principle interacted with. So at the end of the day, detective's goal is to help you through your entire security process in a unified view. Now, today that's the console. We're going to talk a bit more about how you can leverage APIs within detective investigations to automate and programmatically look at any of your IAM issues in your environment. And hopefully we're going to save time. Mileage may vary. We know everybody's estate is a little bit different. But we think detective is positioned well enough that it will help you summarize different security relationships within your environment. And at the end of the day, detective, we'll talk about the graph visualization. If you're familiar with detective, or if you've seen any of the press releases, and you'll see a demo today, but we offer a visualized graph representation of your security findings that you're able to click on, move around, and otherwise play with to help understand and help you with security. Keith?
Thank you, Brent. So for the time being, we're going to take a little bit of a step back out of detective. So it's a good overview of the background and really kind of detail a recent scenario that was published by our friends at Lacework. Link is down at the bottom there for these next several slides of an event that was occurring in the wild. So we're going to go through each step that composed the entire event. And then in addition to kind of the details about the new releases, which Brent will produce, I'll then take you through kind of investigating this incident using detective and chaining together kind of all of the new releases to really go end to end. So the first piece of this, an exposed Grafana dashboard. So Grafana, great dashboarding software, very widely used. Personally, I love it. There are some recommendations about kind of making it publicly accessible or not, but there are certainly some valid use cases for doing so. It may be a monitoring dashboard, it may be sharing metrics with customers or externally, whether that is directly accessible behind some sort of minimal portal, something else. Well, in this particular kind of setup for the activity at hand, they are directly accessible dashboard instances, and that's kind of where we're going to start. Like any software, there are often vulnerabilities that crop up. In this particular case, there is the CVE listed, multiple years old. However, as I'm sure everybody is aware, vulnerability management is an ongoing prioritization task, much similar to what Brent detailed as far as threat response perspective. And in some cases, depending on priority of infrastructure, that may not be immediately patched. Now, in this case, this CVE is remotely exploitable and allows for SSRF. So for folks that don't know, SSRF would allow crafting of a particular URL to then retrieve a response remotely from that Grafana instance. Now, in this case, as some of you may have predicted, the next step, these particular instances, which Grafana is hosted on and accessible, we're using IMDS version 1. Very happy to announce, if folks did not see the announcement in the upper right corner there, this will no longer be an option on new instance types starting mid-next year. And default for auto setups and quick start guides is also in process of being converted to IMDS v2. So that's super exciting. But notably, there is also a Security Hub configuration check for use of IMDS v1, and that is going to come into play later. But just kind of noting the coverage here within the enterprise security services for these particular aspects. Follow on from that, which was present in the scenario, we aren't actually going to see it in our demo as some kind of variation, but there was also some occurrences of DNS rebinding. So in this case, an attacker is able to kind of trick the EC2 instance or application running into responding with a response based on a false DNS resolution. And so in this particular case, that would be something like binding a particular domain request to the metadata service IP address. And again, there is coverage within enterprise security services via guard duty for this particular portion of the attack. You may sense a theme. We have some individual coverage. Same story here. So exfiltrated credentials, as Brent mentioned, identity and credential use, still primary vector for folks and primary concern. And so there are two particular findings within guard duty, for instance, which would call us out depending on the scenario. So you may have credentials which are exfiltrated and used outside of AWS altogether, or credentials exfiltrated and used inside another AWS account. So that would be the two findings here. You'll get, depending on the situation, one of those two. And so what I want you to kind of think about as we go forward with the kind of particular service feature launches, and then when we get to the investigation specifically is, what would this look like in your organization, in your SOC for your analysts? So if we take the assumption that you've received guard duty findings for the couple of activities that we mentioned and kind of work backwards, right? Does your SOC, do your analysts have a clean way to tie those particular findings, those active threats, to any of the preventative side of this equation, right? So we have the attack surface. We mentioned with the network reachability, the Grafana instance was publicly accessible. We have the vulnerabilities on that instance, the CVEs. We have the configuration-based findings from Security Hub for IMDS v1. Those are all preventative, right? They're things that are found, should be remediated before they're exploited. In cases where that doesn't occur, an active threat occurs, you have the last two aspects here from guard duty, and then when you dive into the investigation, which would be detective and security lake, you are basically trying to tie the front end of that to your response. How quickly can you do that? Can your analysts do that? Are they empowered to do that right now? Are those two separate teams? Do you have findings from the first half of that going to a vulnerability management or posture management team? You have findings from the latter half going to your analysts. Are they all going to the same place? Can they be linked readily? We'll walk through exactly what detective provides in that area.
All right. So how can detective help? Well, first and foremost, we want to be an extension of the security analyst. We want to think like a security analyst. We want to operate like a security analyst. Therefore, our goal is to amplify the security analyst. The best way we found to do that in Detective is to partner with Bedrock. Bedrock allows us to interact with its foundational models to help us summarize and process security events as they happen and allow investigations to move faster. So we've introduced finding group summaries. What is a finding group summary? So we've talked about how we put together the different entities like EC2 instances and IAM principles and vulnerabilities and maybe a C2 or a command and control communication that happened. And when we look at that, we can say, okay, yep, I see all these different findings. They seem to make sense. I don't quite know how they work. Well, with Bedrock, we can change that because we can summarize the event that occurred, and your analyst can quickly understand what happened in natural language with Detective finding group summaries. The power of generative AI in security is one of the coolest things that we've been able to use. But we found today that our analysts just want to get right to the summary. They want to understand, what do I do next? How does this help me? So when we talk about what do we do next, diving into a role session here, for example, with demo admin, they disabled CloudTrail. They're trying to cover their tracks. Well, I want to know a bit more about that demo admin account. So again, how can Detective help? Well, we talked a bit about investigating IAM principles, and Detective Investigations allows you to do just that. So when we talk about Detective Investigations, we're really looking for anomalous behavior, things that are not quite baseline, things that don't fit, that don't make sense. Things like impossible travel. Did Keith travel from, let's say, Virginia to Hawaii in 2 hours? Probably not. Maybe. But if we saw something like that, that could raise a red flag. Maybe something a little bit more realistic would be maybe from, let's say, Portland to somewhere in Russia, potentially. That might be weird. Maybe a credential was sold somewhere. And then when we look at how we baseline, we're looking at a complete activity of your cloud estate powered by the Detective graph, because as we learn, data in, data out, the better quality in, the better results you get out. Same thing goes with investigations. Now, when we talk about the breadth and depth of the ability to get into the entities and understand those relationships, we start mapping them to TTPs from MITRE. And what we're able to do is classify every API call that was made by an IAM principal or involved with an IAM principal and assign a level of impact to that. So you can prioritize which, in this case, IAM user demo admin calls were the most impactful to your environment. Because let's say they created another user. Let's say they started deleting buckets. Let's say they started deleting complete instances or deleting accounts or creating new accounts or spinning up new regions, for example. The ability to triage that and put all of those different pieces together would take a normal security analyst anywhere from 2 to 8 hours on average. Detective Investigations runs in 3 to 5 minutes tops. And after processing that data, an analyst can have an understanding of what happened with that IAM principal within about 15 minutes. And if that analyst wants to share that investigation with anybody else, let's say during handoff, or in a threat intel briefing, or maybe just a general report to close an investigation, you can export that report and share it, whether that's via console or via the Detective Investigations API. All right, so we talked about closing investigations and getting down to the root cause. Well, looking at TTPs and understanding API calls is helpful, but at the end of the day, we have to get down to the raw logs. We need to look at the exact log line that was in CloudTrail, that was in VPC flow logs, that will help us get to, not so much the whodunit, but the log line that we need to either pivot because we want to start hunting for more artifacts in our environment and go back to Detective and search for something that was of interest to us, or maybe we found another IAM user that we wanted to investigate. But by partnering with Amazon Security Lake, analysts can now not only benefit from generated queries from Detective. That's right, analysts don't have to write queries for this. We provide it pre-canned for you. Click of a button, you're able to pull those log lines back from Security Lake, leveraging Athena, within Amazon Detective. Now let's say you understand the queries and you want to go a step further. Maybe that query didn't quite work for you. Maybe you want to change it a little bit, you want to open it up a little bit. We also allow users to be able to tune those queries for better data response. And if you want to download all of those log lines, let's say you wanted just a couple, you can do that. Let's say you want all 100, you can do that too. And of course, with the investigation not really stopping, we need to be able to pivot. And Keith's going to talk a little bit about credential compromise and the ability to look for one bad thing, do an investigation, and then pivot to the next in order to find the root cause and ensure that you're solving for the most impactful items within your security environment.
All right, so we have the scenario. It's the scenario we talked about earlier. We have all of the new features. We're going to put the two together, basically show how to use those new features to investigate a particular scenario that was published in the blog that we reviewed. So I'm going to start off. So within Detective, this finding group list here is one way to get into a finding group within the service. If there are multiple, you will see multiple here as there are in this particular case. This would be a great place to start your day, to keep an eye on basically if a new finding group was formed. So Detective is in the background processing, as Brent mentioned, all of the findings. We have informational findings that internally we colloquially refer to as evidence. It also takes those into account, the impossible travel, newly observed APIs, things like that. We also just stitch this with overall activity, right? Was a role assumed? If there is suspicious activity involved in that particular kind of, say, neighborhood in the analysis on the graph, then we will be able to group those together. So that's one way, is going directly to kind of the list of finding groups within Detective. However, we recently implemented a notification as well. So one other way that people often pivot into Detective is via guard duty. You can pivot directly into a finding or directly to a resource. So the background picture there is the guard duty console. There is an investigate in Detective link which allows you to choose what resource you want to drop into or finding. If you do that now, and there is a finding group that subsumes that particular resource or finding, we're going to tell you that, hey, you probably don't want to look at this in isolation. You want to take this into account with a wider set of activity. Would you prefer to go to that activity first to review that rather than for this specific entity? So that's what you see in the foreground here, and you can choose to either pivot to the finding group itself or stay for your target destination. Here we have the landing page for a finding group, and notably including now what Brent detailed with the summarization feature powered by Bedrock. In this particular case, if we take it in the context of the scenario that we have a human readable summary that there is an instance which is both publicly accessible on port 3000, which is notable because port 3000 is the default public port for Grafana. We know that in our scenario, Grafana was the particular software that was targeted. We also have a description basically that calls out that there is likely credential exfiltration from the same instance, which is publicly accessible. So we've already got kind of a decent indication, maybe more suspicious than receiving either of those findings in isolation. Notably, like the publicly accessible finding, a lot of times it's going to be a different team potentially handling that than your response analyst, which may get the guard duty finding, so there may not be an initial connection there. We're putting those all together for you. You can also see the tactic map here, which we don't populate if we aren't sure, right? It's not good to guess. We want to have a solid understanding. So there are cases in which you're going to see that this doesn't have anything highlighted. That's an indication that our confidence is not high enough in those particular cases to call something out as a sure fact, right? We don't want to kind of overstate. Now, we can certainly dig into what is occurring, and we will go through that so that you can close those gaps. And then you can see just the top of the graph visualization, which we will also dive further into. So closer here, you can see the graph is a visual representation of all of the aspects that we have grouped based on the finding group algorithm. Notably in this case, kind of in the center in the red there, you have the guard duty instance credential exfiltration, which would be one of your threat-based findings generated in this particular scenario. Likely the finding that would get the most attention most quickly from your response analysts in the SOC. However, in addition to that, you can see all of the networking components which are connected to that finding, as well as the role and the role session involved for the instance. And notably beyond that, some additional configuration and CVE-based findings. So from the EC2 instance, for instance, you can see that in this case there are a very large number, 100 plus, but we have collapsed basically all of the inspector CVE findings to a single node here. And then we also have the network reachability finding off of that EC2 instance. So I'm starting to put together kind of a clear picture of what the likely scenario is here. The summarization really takes all of the inputs from this graph and turns it into paragraph-style prose. So if I want to read that, get a good idea, at this point, I'm fairly confident this is something that's real. I have multiple inputs from detective, inspector, guard duty, all in one spot. And I'm going to continue, probably escalate, move this to another tier or team, and really dig in. We realize people don't want to pivot, right? So I want to do everything I can from within one investigative interface. If I click the finding in the visual here, I get the same set of finding details which are present in guard duty, so I don't have to pivot back and forth. Those are also available within detective. And we highlight kind of the directly connected aspects on the graph which are present in whatever you've selected. So in this case, I confirm, for our kind of particular scenario, the names involved so that we don't have to kind of highlight them or fuzz them out, are relatively generic, but I can confirm in this case, Grafana is probably running. And if I want to see what the CVEs are and I click on that collapsed node, I get a populated list of all of the inspector CVE findings. If you can see, which there are a couple there listed in Grafana, ideally, any particular instance maybe isn't subject of this many CVEs, and I'm not going through quite that big a list. But this gives more credence to kind of the collection of what I've got. As an analyst, I'm probably going to dig into those particular CVEs to determine if they are indeed remotely exploitable, and that would probably solidify my suspicions. Now, from there, if I've escalated and I want to keep diving deeper, I'm going to probably move out of the finding group, which is a great summarization, gives me high confidence that this is indeed an active threat, and a good view on how the particular perpetrator may have entered the system. So I'm going to select that role. I'm going to click the identifier and pivot to the role profile. So what we've got in the foreground here is the beginning of a role profile. The first thing you'll see if you click that in detective, we provide a summary of information, who created it, when it was last observed, what account it's in, things like that, to get a kind of lay of the land. Is this production or not? Is it something that might have access to sensitive data based on naming schemes or things like that? Items that may kind of, for me personally, within any particular organization, raise or lower importance if we have multiple active things going on at one time. And now, with detective investigations, we have that orange button in the upper right. So for any role or user, I can click that to run an investigation. What detective is going to do, as Brent mentioned, is take a look at all of the factors that we're aware of for that particular entity, as well as do a complete mapping of all of the activity within my defined scope time. So in this particular case, we are trying to answer, okay, we're fairly confident that this is indeed an active incident. I need to take a look. What did that role do within my time frame? How serious is it? How early in the process, did they get access and immediately start running a lot of things? Do I have some window here to remediate quickly and kind of prevent anything serious from occurring? And that's precisely what we see here. So in this particular case, there is a summary at the top which basically details between your start and end date. These are the suspicious items that we have observed. We're going to, in this case, we've ranked it a high, and I just want to call that out because in this scenario, the TTP mappings, which is based on CloudTrail activity for that role, we didn't have anything be above a low severity occurrence. So basically, that means that it's largely just enumeration or non-modification based events, right? So they're not changing or impacting anything that's running, whether it be creating, deleting, modifying. The reason that's important, that indication of being a low severity type of CloudTrail activity, but still being a high severity report, basically indicates that we're very confident that this is correct. And that is worth kind of bringing forward because kind of the matrix of those combinations, this could have been a medium potentially, but that would have indicated kind of lower confidence. Given that we are highly confident based on the factors analyzed, we still ranked it a high report. And so in this particular case, you can see we've got tactics that are in the low severity, but we also have the fact that this was directly involved in findings as well as correlated to a finding group. Those are heavily weighted, especially the finding group correlation. And that kind of all comes into how we put together the results for the report. Beyond that, if I click the other tab, I can get actual specifics. So for all of the TTPs or tactics identified, you can see specifically what they were, as well as the details involved in them. So these may go into, as Brent mentioned, kind of a more custom security lake query. They may be something that you can pivot to the profile within Detective to get more details and dig deeper into each of those. We will do some of that with further scoping now that we're relatively sure that this is indeed an active incident which needs to be addressed. And that's where I'm going to continue kind of investigating with the role. So I know at this point, high likelihood, high confidence, full report. Now I'm going to really aim to dig into what did they do, what do I need to get for logs, so I can put my final report together, kick this off for remediation, remediate the issue, clean it up. So if I go back to the role profile itself, the background here is an overview picture of the overall CloudTrail activity. And so it'll give you kind of a indication of the periodicity of that activity. And, if it's an automated role, you may see very kind of defined patterns. If it's a human-based role, you may not. So in some cases, just the volume during those time windows may give indication that something could be amiss. In this particular case, relatively consistent, absent the one kind of section of a couple of failed API calls on the bottom there. If we could kind of circle back to the initial finding group, you'll see that there's one perpetrator IP that was suspicious. It was the IP, the source of the guard duty finding for credential use in another AWS account. If we click on one of those bars in the background picture, basically we get what's in the foreground here. So we can dig into each one or select multiple, which is the case here where we've got several selected, and dig into the actual API calls in a variety of kind of groupings, whether it be by IP address, by service, or by principal. And, or in this case, it would be, so role session would be the grouping within a role. And we can see exactly what occurred during that window, whether they succeeded or failed. And it would give us a view of the services interacted with. And really give us a chance to kind of focus on what might be of interest to dig into. So in this case, I may want to see kind of why those particular failures occurred, or I may want to get an indication of what the responses were from some of the successful calls. And that is where the Security Lake integration comes in. So from within that window, I can either retrieve all of the data that correlated to the drill down that we had there, and click that query raw logs button, which will give us this modal here. So as Brent mentioned, you can preview these directly within Detective. You can download them for analysis offline, or you can pivot to Athena to make a change to the query, or to see the results in the native kind of Athena interface. You can also get very specific. So in the case where there's a lot of API events, or the particular role may have been used by multiple sources, you may want to get events maybe that were just for a particular service, or that may be particularly destructive. Within the drill down, you can choose any particular line item, and that query will then specify and retrieve only the data from that resource, from that IP, for that service, for that API method. You will get those back specifically. You don't have to dig through kind of a large result set. You get exactly what you're looking for, use that as you need to for your report or other use, and move on. So from an investigation standpoint, the next thing that I want to do, I know exactly what that IP address did. I've got the raw logs. I'm certain that this is indeed an incident that I need to remediate. I want to make sure that there was no other observed activity from that IP address, or any other indicator that we uncovered for that matter, beyond just the activity for that role that I was looking for. And so from there, from that drill down, I'm going to click the IP address at hand, and I'm going to pivot to the IP address profile within Detective. I'm going to get a lot of kind of overview information similar to the role here, where we're going to see when it was first and last seen, total number of API calls that were made, seen, observed in CloudTrail from this source. I'm also going to know immediately, whether it was in a finding group, which, as we know in this case, it was, as well as the particular findings it was focused on. Here I see there were 17 total observances. Remembering back from that drill down, there were 17 calls. So I know as far as CloudTrail is concerned, there was no other activity for any other role or user from this IP address within my scope time. And in this case, all time, since that is an all-time number. But I'm also curious, okay, did I see this anywhere else? That's CloudTrail. There's other ways it could interact in my environment. So one thing we love using, the resource interaction tab, and that will give you a very quick answer to that question. Did I see this anywhere else in my environment at any point in time? In this case, we see that it interacted with the role in our finding group. No VPC flow traffic to any of my instances at any point in time with this IP address. Can answer that immediately. So if you think back to the process at the beginning, right? We ran through a very similar graph. A lot of questions around kind of what would this look like in your environment? Would your analysts in the investigation and response phase have the information required to put this all together quickly? How long would it take them? Is it handled by two separate teams? So finding groups kind of fills that gap, particularly with all the preventative aspects, right? We put together the findings from all of the preventative sources, as well as the threat-based response. And we give you an overall view of activity that is correlated with all the details you need to understand the incident and start your response. And then with several of the new features that we detailed today, we also fill the investigation and response side of that equation. So you can use detective investigations to get a more thorough understanding of the activity from that user or role. You can use the detective assistant to get a kind of human readable interpretation of your finding group. So you have both a visual interpretation as well as something more textual. And you can use the Security Lake integration to actually retrieve the raw records at hand. Also worth noting, so we detailed the CloudTrail integration based queries for that security lake integration. However, that also works with VPC Flow and other sources. So if you are on an EC2 instance profile, for instance, and you want to get the full details of the communication that occurred, same interaction pattern, you can click query. That will be pre-populated and return the results to you. And then based on all of that information, you've got all you need to put your report together, initiate response, and close out the activity.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith. So everyone's ready to go investigate and look and see if you do have Grafana in your environment, you can fire up Detective and get started. You can call Keith if you need anything. I'll share his number at the end. Sorry, Keith. Everybody should have a Keith, right? It's awesome. That's why we have a Keith. Keith is awesome when it comes to helping us understand our investigations and our threat landscape and helping us educate our customers on how to perform investigations that matter. Grafana is a single instance and an example of a vulnerability that could be exploited in a cloud environment, and how to investigate it and come to the end and say, okay, I've closed this down, I'm not worried about this anymore. I've either protected my Grafana instance, I've closed it, I've removed it, I can monitor and I can sleep and maybe get through Christmas or the holiday period, because we tend to see vulnerabilities about this time of year, unfortunately. So top of mind is when vulnerabilities come, Detective can help out. Make sure you have Inspector and Guard duty as well. And we have a 30-day free trial, so if you'd like to kind of kick the tires a little bit, play around, ingest some data, and go through our example investigation today, you can do so. There's a couple different ways to get familiar with Detective, as it seemed like a lot of folks weren't as super familiar. We have workshops, we have immersion days, and of course, you can jump into the management console, and there's various videos to help you kind of go through an investigation, understand how the different tools work within Detective. I'll stop here for a second, and just to reiterate our releases, this reInvent. We've integrated with Bedrock to provide generative AI for all security investigations within Detective with our finding group summaries. We've taken a step further within our finding groups and allow you to investigate IAM principles and understand the actions that may have taken within your cloud estate. You can dig into the raw logs with the Security Lake integration in order to see what you need to do or pivot into your next threat hunt when it comes to closing those investigations and manipulating your logs as required, pulling them out, running the queries. And again, the queries are provided. It's a great starting point. We're going to continue to iterate with generative AI. We're going to continue to iterate with investigations. So be sure to come visit us in Philadelphia for Reinforce. And thank you all for coming.